And we move on to our second speaker today, Professor Benjamin Nathans, who is the Ronald S. Lauder Associate Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, and the co-editor of Culture Front, representing Jews in Eastern Europe, and is currently completing a book entitled The Success of Our Hopeless Cause, A History of Soviet Dissident Movement. And this is also the subject of his paper today. Refuseniks and Right Defenders, Jews' Rights in the Soviet Dissident Movement.
Thank you, Iris, for the kind introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference for bringing me here. And I have to acknowledge the presence in the room of someone whose work is indispensable for anyone who wants to write about Refuseniks and late Soviet society, and that is Professor Yaakov Roy. I'm very happy that you came today. I want to start by inviting you back to October 1970. Thank you. October 1970, on the eve of Simchat Torah, when an enormous crowd gathered in front of the Moscow Choral Synagogue. A report on this meeting was put together by the head of the 5th Division of the KGB, the one responsible for monitoring internal dissent, a man named Philip Babkov, sent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, in which he estimated that roughly 12,000 individuals had taken part and that they had been singing and dancing to what he called nationalist songs. Babkov also reported that the celebration included the circulation of a samizdat text, a self-published text, circulated from hand to hand, containing a copy of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had been distributed among this crowd of 12,000 or so by what he labeled Zionist students from local institutions of higher education who were seeking to foster the emigration mood. The appearance of the Universal Declaration as Ersatz Torah at the dawn of a decade that has been characterized by leading human rights historians, including Sam Moyn, as the breakthrough, invites us to revisit the relationship between Soviet Jewish activists and the broader dissident movement. The presence of such a large crowd at an unsanctioned gathering in the capital of the Soviet Empire helps remind us that in its heyday, the Jewish national movement was both larger than and more diverse than the group known as the Rights Defenders, the Pravozащитники, the kind of core element of the dissident movement writ large. At least if we measure size by attendance at demonstrations and the ability to marshal signatures on collective petitions. In fact, among the many different ethnic and national activists who were striving for greater autonomy or geographic relocation, Soviet Jews were second in number only to one, and that is the Crimean Tatars. Like many episodes of social protest, dissent in the late Soviet era consisted of a congeries of loosely allied groups with overlapping but distinct grievances vis-a-vis the Soviet system. Russian and other nationalists were looking for cultural and political autonomy. Religious believers sought greater freedom to worship and to transmit their faith to their children. Punished peoples, such as the Crimean Tatars, struggled to return to ancestral homelands inside or outside the Soviet Union, while neo-Leninists and monarchists sought to return to their imagined pasts. The Rights Defenders, the dissidents with a capital D, strove to uphold civil liberties enshrined in the Soviet Constitution, some of them mentioned by Dina, and in international rights covenants such as the Universal Declaration and, after 1975, the Helsinki Accords. Over the course of the 1970s and up to the eve of the USSR's dissolution, only a single one of these dozen or more groups could actually claim a visible breakthrough in achieving its self-declared goals, and that was the movement for Jewish emigration. Between that Simchat Torah gathering in 1970 in Moscow and Leonid Brezhnev's death in 1982, the Kremlin permitted over 250,000 Jews to exit the USSR. This achievement was not only without parallel in the annals of dissent in the Soviet Union One recent study has called it, quote, the preeminent case of Jewish human rights activism, period. As with the unraveling of the Soviet Union, many parties have been eager to claim credit for this astonishing fact. The determination and fortitude of Soviet Jewish activists and the larger community of Refuseniks have been celebrated in dozens of first-person accounts. The movement's genesis is commonly ascribed to factors both inside and outside the Soviet Union. And I'm just going to briefly rehearse these or remind you what they are. Rising discrimination in education and employment threatened to reverse what had been a meteoric rise of Jews within the Soviet system. Israel's transformative victory in the Six-Day War gave many Soviet Jews, in similar ways to their counterparts around the world, a visceral sense of identification with the Jewish state. The lion's share of academic scholarship, especially in English, on the mass emigration of Soviet Jews has focused on the relationship between the Jewish national movement inside the Soviet Union to actors on the other side of the Iron Curtain. That is, it's been a precociously transnational history. Those actors include citizens' initiatives in the United States, Canada, and Britain for purposes of freeing Soviet Jewry, the United States Congress and its passage of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in 1974, linking U.S. trade to Soviet policies on immigration, and, to the limited extent possible given the slim availability of sources, the work of Israel's Lishkat HaKesher. Today I want to explore the relationship of the Jewish national movement to actors closer to home, namely to the rights defenders who championed Soviet civil rights and international human rights, including the right to leave one's country. The burgeoning field of human rights history has drawn attention to the variety of ways by which local movements have deployed what was rapidly becoming the dominant moral vocabulary of the late 20th century global society. This process is of particular salience to the Jewish national struggle in the USSR, insofar as that struggle constituted, by the mid-1970s, one of the most prominent human rights arenas of the Cold War, repeatedly insinuating itself into superpower summits and front-page headlines. For Soviet Jewish activists, international prominence was a double-edged sword, ensuring high visibility, but also entangling the hoped-for Jewish exodus in a host of geopolitical issues, from Soviet relations with the Arab world to the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. Such entanglements mirrored the tensions that typically arise when human rights norms are applied to an emphatically national particularist movement. Those tensions, in turn, found their sharpest expression in the fraught relations between individual refuseniks and rights defenders, or within individuals who at various times belonged or attempted to belong to both communities. It should come as no surprise that, as with the late imperial Russian revolutionary movement, a significant number of late Soviet-era dissidents were of Jewish background, far higher than the proportion of Jews in the Soviet population at large. And I have in mind here not the dissident Slavophile and westernizing icons, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov, whom their enemies tellingly accused of having changed their original names from Solzhenitsker and Zuckerman, but rather a striking range of cardinal figures, starting with Alexander Yesenin Volpin, the progenitor of the rights-based strategy of dissent, whose mother was Jewish, and on to other prominent Jewish dissidents, including Larisa Bogoraz-Bruchman, one of the organizers, along with Pavel Litvinov, who was the grandson of Maxim Litvinov, a.k.a. Meyer Wallach Finkelstein, of the August 1968 demonstration in Red Square against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. I have in mind Natalia Gorbanovskaya, who attended that demonstration and was one of the founders a year later of the Chronicle of Current Events, the most important dissident periodical. Her father was Jewish. And to this list of prominent dissidents of Jewish origin could be added many others, including the biologist Raisa Berg, Yelena Bonner, Ilya Gabay, Yuri Glazov, Semyon Gluzman, Lev Kopelev, Dina Kaminskaya, Viktor Krasin, Grigory Pomerantz, Boris Shragin, Boris Zuckerman, Piotr Weil, Piotr Yakir, and many, many others. Even among Russian Orthodox dissidents, 3 of the most significant were of Jewish origin: Alexander Men, Anatoly Levitin Krasnov, and Mikhail Mersin Aksionov. I am outraged that 85% of the democratic movement members are Jews, quipped the poet Naum Korjavin, a.k.a. Mandel. The percentage ought to be fair, 50-50. It was not only that the dissident movement was ethnically mixed. Thanks to high rates of intermarriage among the first generation of the Soviet intelligentsia, so were many of their offspring who composed it and who had, without exception, grown up in the intensely multi-ethnic Soviet milieu. Equally striking, among leading activists in the Jewish national movement were more than a few individuals who began as rights defenders advocating the general rule of law, Soviet law, only to shift their activities, typically beginning in the late 1960s, to the world of the Refuseniks. Mikhail Agursky, Mark Asbel, Eduard Kuznetsov, Vitaly Rubin, Anatoly Sharansky, Vladimir Slepak, Julius Telyesin, Maya Ulanovskaya, Alexander and Nina Varanyel belong to this category, some as defectors, others as bridge builders between these two settings. To the best of my knowledge, there was not a single example of movement in the opposite direction, from the Refusnik to the rights-defending cause. While Sakharov and other rights defenders privately expressed regret that so many members of the Jewish intelligentsia, and therefore from their point of view, potential supporters of the dissident movement, were seeking to leave the USSR, they consistently spoke out in support of Soviet Jews whose applications for visas had been refused. Within 2 years of its founding, the Chronicle of Current Events was featuring a regular section called News from the Jewish Community, reporting on instances of rejected visa applications, arrests and trials of Jewish activists, and the fate of those who had been sent to the camps. Sakharov and other members of the Moscow Committee for Human Rights, which was founded in 1970, added their signatures to some of the earliest petitions by Refuseniks and attended numerous public demonstrations by and trials of Refuseniks. In one of his most controversial acts, because it violated the dissident movement's categorical rejection of violence, Sakharov petitioned the Soviet government for clemency for Mark Dimshitz and Eduard Kuznetsov, leaders of a group of Refuseniks in the attempted hijacking of a plane in Leningrad in June 1970, who had been sentenced to death for treason. In his memoirs, Sakharov acknowledged that, quote, there was some question whether the Leningrad hijacking affair was properly a human rights matter, end quote. Human rights were indeed the lens through which the dissidents judged the issue of Jewish emigration. And precisely because they framed the exit from one's country as a human right, as a necessary component of freedom of movement and thus of human dignity, rights defenders sidestepped the specifically Jewish rationale for emigration, grounded in the Zionist idea of return to the Jewish homeland. In a letter of September 21, 1971, addressed to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, Sakharov wrote that, quote, Soviet citizens of Jewish as well as many other nationalities, Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Armenians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Turko-Meshkedians, and others, who are striving to leave for personal, national, or other reasons, are being denied permission for years without cause, and these denials reduce their lives to a constant torment of waiting, end quote. Rights defenders also avoided the analogous Soviet rationale of repatriation, grounded in Moscow's long-standing policy of territorializing certain Soviet ethnic and national groups in their putative Republican or regional homelands. Consistent with Article 13 of the Universal Declaration, moreover, Sakharov, Yesenin Volpin, Vladimir Bukovsky, and other leading rights defenders insisted on the right to leave one's country of birth, and that right should be paired with the right to return to it. How did Soviet Jewish activists view rights defenders and their principled maximalism on the subject of emigration? As the historian Juliana Furst has noted in one of the many volumes produced by Professor Roy, for all of the talk of specifically Jewish factors behind the Jewish national movement in the USSR, Soviet anti-Semitism, the influence of Leon Uris's popular novel Exodus, Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. For all of these specifically Jewish factors, the Refuseniks and the rights defenders actually were largely formed by the same Soviet institutions and overwhelmingly belonged to the same historical generation, the so-called people of the 60s, as well as to the same privileged social class, the intelligentsia. Whether or not they had first taken part in the broader dissident movement, Jewish activists began by adopting many of that movement's techniques, couching their demands in terms of law and rights, staging public demonstrations, and above all, creating an alternative sphere of communication via samizdat. All of which, by the way, was in Russian. By the early 1970s, the Jewish national movement was divided between so-called kulturniki, who sought to strengthen Jewish life in the USSR by reviving Jewish culture in the Hebrew language, and politiki, who considered emigration to Israel the only solution to the Soviet Jewish predicament. This was a split eerily reminiscent of that between the Jewish Daisten and Dortisten, the Hearists and the Verists, in the late Tsarist era, except that the proportions were reversed. With Israel no longer a fantasy but a sovereign state, reachable from Moscow within hours via airplane through Rome or Vienna, the politiki easily outnumbered the kulturniki. No less divisive was the split between those who favored and those who rejected cooperation with the broader dissident movement. Those in favor pointed to the many forms of support provided by the Moscow Human Rights Committee and other rights defenders, to the likelihood that a general liberalization of the Soviet regime would foster a more open attitude toward Jewish emigration, and to the bedrock motive for coalition building, namely strength in numbers. Opponents of cooperation with rights defenders offered tactical, moral, and ideological counter-arguments. Association with the broader dissident movement would only heighten the impression that Jewish activists were anti-Soviet, thereby leading to greater repression by the KGB. Those who sought to leave the USSR, it was further argued, do not have the moral right to interfere in the affairs of the country they aimed to abandon. This view, which I believe is antithetical to even a minimal concept of universal human rights, was expressed by many would-be emigrants, including Yevgeny Yakir, the cousin of Pyotr Yakir, arguably the leading rights defender until his arrest in 1972. Finally, participation in the general dissident movement was taken as a symptom of precisely the kind of assimilation that was anathema to Soviet Zionists, a repetition of the fatal Jewish attraction to the Russian revolutionary movement a century earlier. Collaboration with the general dissident movement, according to one activist, would, quote, deprive the Jewish national movement of its spiritual authenticity, its precise goals, and its maneuverability, and without these aspects, it would simply become part of the dissident phenomenon. Shortly before his emigration to Israel in 1975, Alexander Varaniel, who had taken part in the birth of legal dissent at the trial of the writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, went further, quote, we must now remain aloof while it is not yet too late to separate our problems from the Russian people's problems. Otherwise, they will solve our fate together with their problems, and this solution will be radical, end quote. While the Soviet regime still existed, mutual criticisms among the various currents within the dissident movement were understandably muted, given the shared risk of persecution. Memoirs published prior to the 1990s display a distinct reticence in this regard. With the passing of the USSR, as well as of many leading dissident figures, formerly silent grievances have begun to emerge. In a 2007 interview, Varaniel faulted Sakharov for having, quote, always fought for other people, and thus lacking a healthy sense of self-interest. This was a variation on an old theme voiced by Russian nationalist critics of the dissidents in the 1970s. By supporting greater autonomy for Jews, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Baptists, and other minority groups, rights defenders had undermined whatever appeal they might have vis-a-vis the ethnic Russian population, who was an indispensable constituency for any movement claiming to be democratic. For Varaniel, human rights defenders practiced the Christian ideal of self-sacrifice. all the more reason, therefore, for Jews to keep their distance. In their choice of tactics, Jewish nationalist activists increasingly moved beyond rights defenders' strategy of promoting the rule of law, which required remaining strictly within the bounds of law and therefore excluded the strategy, or the tactics, I should say, of civil disobedience. Much more media-savvy than most dissidents, Refuseniks staged sit-ins at the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet wearing yellow stars on their coats, and they made sure that Western journalists were present to photograph them in the act. One of the most extraordinary records of the transformation of a Soviet Jewish rights defender into an anti-Soviet Zionist, and here I'm drawing on the work of my student Alexander Khazanov, can be found in the diaries of Vitaly Rubin, 2-volume diaries published in Jerusalem. A highly regarded sinologist, Rubin kept a diary from 1956 until his death here in Israel in 1981, 5 years after his emigration. In the early 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split provided an early opportunity for Rubin to voice his criticism obliquely of the Soviet system via attacks on Maoist China as a totalitarian state that denied its citizens elementary individual rights. Like many rights defenders, Rubin was devastated by Moscow's crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, the event that more than any other planted seeds of pessimism regarding the dissident movement and triggered Rubin's own decision to apply for a visa to Israel. Just as Cold War concepts of freedom versus totalitarianism had shaped his views on China and the USSR, they increasingly informed his identification with Jews as a free people, in contrast to the slave mentality he found in the Soviet, which is to say Russian, population. To be sure, the antinomies of freedom and slavery had a long history in Zionist thought, going back at least to Ahad Ha'am's 1891 essay, Slavery in Freedom, and the later idea of negation of the diaspora. But these were critiques of Jewish assimilation, or spiritual slavery, as Ahad Ha'am had called it. For Vitaly Rubin and for Cold War Zionism, the freedom of Soviet Jews was now defined as liberation from Russian totalitarian slavery. As his wife Ina Axelrod Rubina wrote in her own memoirs, quote, "The feeling that we were free people came when we submitted our documents to emigrate to Israel." Sharansky similarly describes how widespread approval of the invasion of Prague shaped his view of the mentality of the typical Soviet person. Quote, "His self-respect derived from being part of the Soviet system, and the more powerful the system, the stronger he felt. This mentality constituted the real power of the regime, the consciousness of the slave who looks for guidance to the good Tsar, the leader, the teacher." Sharansky therefore dated his liberation not to his arrival in Israel in 1986, but 13 years earlier, when he applied to leave the Soviet Union. As he writes in his memoir, "At the age of 25, which would mean 1973, I finally learned what a joy it was to be free." I noted earlier that the Jewish national movement was split between those who sought to rebuild Jewish life in the Soviet Union and those who regarded emigration to Israel as the only viable solution to the Jewish predicament, with the latter far outnumbering the former within the movement. It's worth recalling, however, that both kulturniki and politiki were outnumbered by those Soviet Jews who belonged to neither group, and who, when given the choice, emigrated according to the criteria set forth by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, acting as individuals unmotivated by Zionism, repatriation, or any other collective purpose. By 1977, half of all Soviet Jewish emigrants, having crossed the Soviet border with Israeli visas in hand, instead resettled in North America and other regions in the West. A decade later, the proportion of these so-called dropouts had risen to 88%, before being drastically reduced in 1990 by mutual agreement of the U.S. and Israeli governments. The reality of tens of thousands of Soviet Jews deciding for themselves between the logic of repatriation and the logic of the Universal Declaration cast the tension between Soviet Zionists and Soviet rights defenders into exceptionally sharp relief. "We were not only disillusioned," wrote Mark Asbel, the rights defender turned refusenik, near the height of the dropout phenomenon, "we were humiliated. The very possibility of anyone leaving the Soviet Union was due to the heroic efforts of Jews who dreamed of Israel, who sacrificed their liberty and in some cases their lives to build the road to freedom. In our opinion, those who rejected Israel cast shame and mockery upon the memory of these people. To abandon our country, Israel, in favor of another that offered more goods, more choices, I couldn't stop feeling ashamed of the people who made this choice. These same people would run to Israel if the need arose, and if Israel should ever be annihilated again, the rest of the world would despise the Jews who let it happen, and they would be right." End quote. Asbel went on to note that the ruse of applying for a visa to Israel while intending a different destination threatened to undermine the Kremlin's willingness to allow any immigration at all. And it remains indeed a puzzle why Soviet leaders tolerated this legal fiction on a mass scale, which allowed tens of thousands of Soviet citizens to defect to the rival superpower, making a mockery of the repatriation argument in the eyes of both the Soviet population and the rest of the world. One plausible answer is that the alternative, which was keeping tens of thousands of troublesome Jews confined in the USSR, had come to seem even worse than that legal fiction. At various moments in this paper, I have alluded to similarities between arguments about Jewish immigration in the late Soviet and the late imperial eras. I would like to close with a brief attempt to push this historical comparison further in order to illuminate some parallels as well as particularities of the Soviet case. The two political systems themselves, Tsarist and Soviet, were strikingly different when it came to the issue of immigration, Jewish or otherwise. While neither recognized a legal right to leave the country, only the USSR had the actual governing capacity to prevent it. The Tsarist state perpetually struggled to regulate the movement of its population both within and beyond the empire's borders. Much of the Jewish emigration that occurred prior to the 1890s took place illegally via the lucrative trade in human smuggling, and without the invocation of rights of any kind. The Tsarist state eventually permitted transnational entities, above all the Jewish Colonization Association, directed by Baron Maurice de Hirsch, to help organize Russian Jewish emigration at its point of origin, without formally recognizing any legal right on the part of Russian subjects to leave the empire. By 1913, the Jewish Colonization Association had over 500 bureaus in Russia itself, in European Russia, offering information, advice, and financial assistance to would-be emigrants. Needless to say, such arrangements were unthinkable under developed socialism. The forms of collective Jewish organization and advocacy were also dramatically different in the two eras. Late imperial Russian Jewry was a hothouse of political parties, each with its own executive committee, ideological program, dues-paying members, publications, and congresses. Jewish advocacy under the Tsars also made unfettered and abundant use of Jewish languages, especially Yiddish. The Communist Party's monopoly on public life under late Soviet socialism meant that Jewish activists were connected at best by loose networks formed largely through personal and professional ties, as well as through the circulation of samizdat. The steep decline of Jewish languages across the Soviet era meant that Jewish samizdat was produced and consumed in the same discursive space as Russian language samizdat. These contrasting structures, however, had one important quality in common. Both closely mirrored the general forms of oppositional activity of their own time. In both historical scenarios, the quote-unquote general movement, revolutionary in late imperial Russia, dissident in the late Soviet Union, included a disproportionate number of Jews and was stigmatized as a Jewish or Zionist plot. In both eras, key figures passed through a phase of activism in the general movement, only to despair of that movement's capacity to achieve its goals. Moshe Leib, Lillian Blum, Leon Pinsker, Vladimir Medem, and Shlomo Rappaport, known as Ansky, found their distant reflections in Vitaly Rubin, Natan Sharansky, Mark Asbel, and Alexander Varaniel. In the friction between refuseniks and rights defenders, we can hear echoes of the arguments that once divided and connected Bundists and Bolsheviks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nathan, Ben. Our next speaker will return.